Hello, welcome back to the Rhetoric Reviewed podcast. This is week 2, episode 6, and we're getting right into today's topic. So, we had a lot of good discourse from last week, and we hope to find more this week. So, today we're going to be going over the question, are we overpopulated or underpopulated? Now, this might pertain only to America in some parts and to the whole world, or to certain countries, and I'll try to be specific about each when we come to that point. But we're going to go through the introduction, and finally, we're going to end with the future of humanity and some lessons or takeaways you can get from this podcast lecture. So, what is the population? The population is consisting of obviously the whole populace, the people inside of residing in a certain country. But more importantly, population is important when it pertains to the working class, the working population or the labor force. And this is important because the general trend you see across history is that young people work and old people do not. Of course, this is varying from society to society, as some people, in some societies, even the elderly must work to maintain or must work in some sort of fashion. But at least in modernity and past industrial revolution, the elderly have more or less been living off of Social Security, at least since the 1940s, and has been beneficiaries of the welfare system. And off of that, going into birth rates. So what is birth rates? Birth rates is the amount of births per woman who is, of course, of birthing age. Yes. Fertile age. So what the number that people throw around a lot and the number that's widely accepted is 2.1 births as the number of replacement. So replacement number is when you have a certain population, and to at least the very least maintain that population and not lose people just simply due to death, you're going to need 2.1 births per woman to keep that upkeep. So this is ideal. This is the ideal number, 2.1. And some places far exceed this, right? You have places like Niger, Israel, and these places have well above 6 births per woman, at least when you look at it on the large scale. And what this does is it increases its population generation after generation, so long as the birth rate remains that high. And a good way to see the way replacement number manifests is through something we'll be discussing throughout this whole video, which is population pyramids. So I'm going to first show this ideal population pyramid and what this might mean. So the bars are the percentages of the population, and as opposed to in comparison to the age they're at. As you can see here, about from 0 to 70, everything's about level, right? You're aging, and the life expectancy is about 70, so you expect that until then, if you have the same age of replacement, maybe you'll have some people, going above 70, above 80, but more or less you have the same amount of people across each group. And what this creates is a sort of regularity and stability in the system, as no group is overpowering the other. So we're going to be looking at a few of these graphs throughout this video. So the problem with the current situation is that that's not the case. It's not like, everything's the same, at least for some countries, but for the most populated countries and some of the most powerful countries in the modern developed world, that's not a trend that's happening. In fact, countries are losing birth rates, losing people, or will start losing people in the future at an alarming rate. And we'll get into some status quo examples right in a second. And the more important thing to know about this, as we'll get into, is that this has serious implications. While many people say that we're overpopulated based on urban areas, that's not really the case, because a lot of activity happens outside of urban areas, and we still have a lot of land we could technically populate. Not including on Antarctica, of course, if we come to colonize that area. But first, let's get into some contemporary examples. The first one I want to show you is China. So China is famous for being a very large country population-wise. I believe it's like 1.4 or 5 billion right now. And this was, of course, partly due to its large size, but also due to its success economically during, not success, but its increase in economic prosperity throughout the 20th century and the subsequent encouragement of births. So what China had is something called the one-child policy. So this means that families can only have one child, and this was implemented as part of the Communist Revolution back in the early 20th century with Mao Zedong. So what this did is that it created a huge disparity with males and females. So you'll find here on the graph where it's circled, and this is from Asia Times, that there's a huge disparity in the darker blues of men over women. Because men were preferred because they could carry on the family lineage or name, and they were better for working, which was important for agricultural Chinese people. You would often either kill or hide female children in place for male ones. So not only is there a big discrepancy between that, there's also a big discrepancy between the total births. Obviously, you're gonna have above 70. You know, you have a normal regulation, right? This is obviously women tend to live longer across the world, and this is reflective of that. However, the problem is, if you see, there's mainly two, outliers, which is millennials and Gen X, which is that their width is so much more than the other population groups. And this is important because when the older generation is outnumbering the youth, you're going to have labor issues, and we'll get into that very soon. But this is to illustrate how China is currently and how it might impact them in the future, and we'll get into that very soon. So that's China, and next is Korea, which we could have done Japan as well, but I don't want to do too many examples. But these are going to be two countries that have been severely impacted by declining birth rates. That we'll get into the causes, but this is happening all over the developed world. America's an exception because it's at 1.6 right now compared to like 0.8 in South Korea. But the developed world, in Europe, Canada, America, certain, Australia, maybe New Zealand, certain parts of East Asia, this has been a trend over the last 20, 30 years, going back even, I guess, to the 1960s. But the projected birth rates are falling even faster than we thought they would fall. Like, we thought they would fall already, but this is just a scary amount of speed. So again, as promised, we're going to be looking at Korea. So Korea is almost as bad as China here. So if you want to look at the history of Korea, this is from 2023, but you can see very easily that the youth or the young population located at the bottom of the graph is extremely, extremely small. This means that less people were giving birth over the last 10 years or so, and it's been going down ever since Korea's golden age of growth in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. So Korea obviously came out of the Korean War in the 1950s, and since then, for the next 20 years after the fact, they've had multiple military dictatorships, political instability, but most importantly, a general upward trends of prosperity and economical growth. So economical growth at any level doesn't mean you're actually, out of poverty, but growth itself creates hope and expectations for the future in people, and they're more willing to actually have children to supplement labor or themselves, or they're able to actually afford it compared to 10 years before or 5 years before. So China was it's a bit hard to say how China developed, but it was like around the 90s, I think, when the biggest generations of Chinese were born, because that's when America started outsourcing our industry to China, and then they had more jobs, more money, all of this thing. So Korea had a similar golden age, but it's more obvious when it was, which is around the 1960s, 70s, 80s period. I guess not so much 60s. So ever since, Korea's had a huge drop in birth rates, and it's constantly beating its own record as the lowest birth rate country. And that's important because Korea is 99% Korean homogenous, or, everyone's the same race, ethno state, and it's very important to Korean people, right? And that's what's scary about it, because as we'll go into later, immigration is one of the main solutions for this sort of thing. So on the right side, what I didn't have for China, which I do have for Korea, which is even more scary for Korea than for China, is that the projection shows that we're going to be losing so much of the population in Korea by around the 2100s. So even though there's there's more hopeful expectations and projections, the median is still a crazy downwards trend. Korea is, of course, majority urban when it comes to its population density around places like Seoul, Busan, Incheon, right? But there's so much land and there's so much rural areas that aren't fully developed and aren't able to actually continue to develop due to lower government programs and the inability to bring in industry into these areas. And there's a few numbers I've seen thrown around places, and I'm not sure if it's accurate, but I saw somewhere that for every 100 Koreans today, by 2100, there's going to be 4 left. So that's a 96% extinction rate. I'm not sure if I completely believe that number, because there's no way we're not going to be reactive to the changes, that's going to happen, we as the world, I mean. But the general trend does seem scary, and for the issue of an ethno state such as Korea is a dire issue. You don't for the entire race to just go extinct is is just completely hard to wrap yourself around. It's like this self-inflicted genocide, sort of, right? Due to the inability to procreate. If I don't know if that's the appropriate term, but we'll get into why that matters later. So going back to the point, there's serious negative impacts that are associated with population loss and population degrowth. So we've talked about multiple times in the last videos, and I urge you to go look at the first one especially, but technology and history always coincides in the fact that tragedies happen naturally or such once you reach certain points of development and urbanizations. The main point I said was the Black Death. So back then, it might have been a huge disease that wiped out millions and millions of Eurasians, or yeah, Eurasians, right? Like, Britain, France, Turkey, Italy. But that sort of this disaster that brings the population back to control doesn't always need to be towards, some sort of force that's killing you. It doesn't always need to be a plague, disease, war. It could simply be uh, the consequences of certain policies that allowed you to get to that point. For example, industrial revolution, individuality, it promotes all of these things, but ultimately, like where we're at now, we're at a point where individuals matter more than collectives, even in places like East Asia, where collectives have always been more important. And you also can't afford to raise up a family, which is one of the negative consequences of continued capitalism, at least in America, which is probably the worst. It's going to, it's a larger country in the Western world and such, it'll be impacted such should this sort of thing come to pass. So let's go over the negative impacts and why it's bad for the elderly, youth, and the consequences politically. So why it's bad for the elderly. First, we can get into this sort of diagram, and I don't know why the visual's like so off, but this should be like, oh, I see. Okay, that's my bad. All right, well the visual's off, but it should say ideal on the top one and current on the bottom. So ideally, the working class, which is bigger, with all the youths, middle-aged people, maybe even a little bit of elderly people working as CEOs and stuff, the working class generates product, GDP, if you will, if that's a very simplistic way to look at it. The working class generates things, so the elderly class can at least benefit to a certain degree through welfare programs like Social Security. I don't really want to stay on this page for too long, it's ugly. So that's ideal. So what happens when you have a mismatched population pyramid, as with China and Korea, is that this gets thrown off, where the youth or the working class is significantly less than the elderly class, or the people who are dependent on Social Security, welfare, and such. So what ends up happening is that as the elderly still maintain some sort of workforce, or at least as they maintain some sort of power, you're going to find that the youths aren't able to actually support the elderly. They're not able to support Social Security. And what ends up happening as a consequence of this is that there's multiple solutions that a society can implement. So the first negative thing, I guess, would be that elderly people have the chance to not receive the Social Security they need or the welfare in general. Second is that youth will be overworked or will have to pay higher taxes in order to make up for the lost Social Security due to lower amounts of people working. So if we need to, for example, to make like an example, if we need to make 100 pieces of bread for 50 people, the 50 people aren't changing. But if we only have 50% less people to make those 100 loaves, those 50% less of people are going to need to work doubly hard, or more of their actual output is going to need to be taxed. I don't know if I was very coherent there, but the main point is that, yeah, you're going to have negative impacts for both the youth and elderly. Either you don't produce enough and elderly people suffer, or you try to produce too much and the youths their backs are broken. So the possible consequences is that politically this is going to be very unpopular. The higher taxes go, the higher the less affordable life becomes. The youths and especially young men are in their 20s are going to want to rebel against the system. How this manifests is, of course, we'll never know. But historically, this has been in the case of revolutions and such, and currently that doesn't seem likely, but this trend of higher taxes to supplement for aging populations and the lower workforce in the future has been already happening, and Japan is the main contributor or example of this being a negative, because right now affordability is even worse, and it's a vicious cycle, right? You can't afford to have kids, so then you don't have kids, your population is less. That means that you need to work more or taxes will be higher so the elderly can live, right? And that's important, especially more so in East Asian cultures. But in doing so, your taxes are higher, so you have less money, which means you're going to be less incentivized to have children, and this just continues and continues until eventually you come to a breaking point where the system's overhauled, and it becomes easier as people can't reproduce, and that makes you an unhappier person, just evolutionarily. Reproduction is one of the main functions of the evolutionary human psychology. So historically, when it becomes hard to have children, yeah, it's that causes revolutions. So before we get into possible reasons, I guess I do want to talk about the future first and ways to stop this. An issue with uh, sort of immigration-based utilitarianism. So what is immigration-based utilitarianism? Which is that immigration is good for saving countries like Korea, Japan, China, or maybe not so much China, but it's good for saving these countries because you have multiple options and more labor force from places with higher birth rates. So an example would be Niger, which has over 6.8 births per woman and is set to grow. Obviously, this isn't sustainable as you're just gonna have a ballooning population. But right now, it seems that places like Philippines, Indonesia, Niger, all of these, I guess what you might call second world developing countries, these places are able to send immigrants abroad to work. This is an issue because, again, as we mentioned, ethno-states matter. For a lot of people, ethnicity isn't just a feature. It's a essential part of their culture heritage, and it's very specific to them. In America, it's easy to forget that. It's easy to think that the norm for us is that we are integrated, that, despite our population still being majority Caucasian, or at least Anglo, we still do have an integrated society at the scale that no one's ever seen before. We're not, even though people call us like divisive, this is a new experiment with so many different people being implemented. Like if you take a look at history, think about in the 20th century, did the Balkans work out? Did multiple ethnic groups were often historically contrary work out together? The answer is no. Right now, they still all hate each other, or at least to a certain degree, some of them do. Right? Think about like Serbians versus Turks. I don't know. Anyways, immigration is pushed, at least from the American side, or at least American thinkers, because we believe that it should be good, and that it's silly to be scared of immigration or changing cultures and integration and changing populations. But the reality is that that's not the norm. That for many countries, especially more homogenous ones, ethnic homogeneity does matter. For example, a lot of things in your culture can be directly based on your either perhaps skin color, behavior, your tendencies, what's good for your body. There's concepts all over the world how, food from the country you come from is the best fit for your body, and that may or may not be true evolutionarily, but these concepts build on each other. And seeing familiar people that, despite everything, at least you're of the same blood, that matters to these countries. And to simply say that it's okay to phase some smaller races out of existence for the interests of economic prosperity is simply ridiculous. So to say that we should flood South Korea, Japan, with immigrants to supplement their lowering population is completely insensitive to the issue of cultural homogeneity and ethnic homogeneity in and of itself. So we shouldn't be trying to find a solution by just jamming immigrants where they don't belong, where they're not going to integrate, where people don't want them there. We should try to find solutions that attack the problem from the root cause. What's causing these people to not have children? What's some underlying social and economic issues? And we'll get into that very soon. But I first wanted to address what's going on when it comes to the immigration issue. Immigration is being, of course, used on large, and that's what's kind of sustaining America right now. America has, despite all of, we'll see how this goes throughout the Trump administration, but at least how it's going right now, America does have a high immigrant population, and it looks like we'll have one in the future. So we're a bit out of order, but I guess we'll next go to the possible reasons. So first we'll do economic reasons, which is that price of living and just affordability of houses, even food, groceries nowadays is just untenable to afford another mouth, especially one that grows, that one that needs programs. You need to take care of them, time out of your day. working. You need them to go to programs, school, more tax. Well, I guess you get tax cuts, but more expenses. All of these things, we might offer tax breaks to people when for having kids, but when wages aren't going up high enough to actually, meet this, as you can see on the screen here, the monthly mortgage payment necessary, it's not possible to actually encourage people to have kids because they can't even support themselves. I think it's like 60% of Americans can't afford a $1,000 emergency bill. And that is irrelevant because $1,000 might save your life when it comes to buying something at a hospital or such, or getting treatment. So the current economic situation just simply isn't, you're not able to justify having kids, at least on large, to a rate that's noticeable compared to times past. So of course, this graph here isn't inflation adjusted, but the inflation adjusted one does also have a veritable spike after in the post-COVID era, and when it comes to mortgage payment rates. So any mortgage rate increase or general CPI or consumer price index increase that's not supplemented by a higher wage or higher or lower taxes is you're going to have eventual downturn. And there are multiple times over the last few decades this has been a major trend. Home ownership is just more difficult, and real wages, not nominal wages, which nominal means inflation adjusted, have not been able to keep up. And as inequality grows, this is going to be even more so the problem. And the people, and here's the funny thing, this wasn't normally part of my video, but it just came up, is that the wealthier people who can afford to have kids don't have that many, because, or nor do wealthier people or educated people have marriages in the same rate that uneducated people, or I guess not college or collegiate people do. Um, that's something I wanted to say. All right, but right, that's the economical point, that people just can't afford to own a home, make enough money for themselves, pay rents, mortgages. All of these things are just simply a part of the human condition in the 21st century that prevents young people from doing so. So what's also interesting is I mentioned multiple times in my last few videos how human lifespan has been expanding and it doesn't seem to stop getting better. So when a human lifespan expands, wow, you're gonna also have people who work longer, who live longer. So not only is in these initial few graphs, the amount of the population that reaches 80, 90, 100 even is going to keep growing, which means there's even more elderly people that need to be supported. So not only is technology increasing, so not only are we increasing the population of elderly by increasing technology that helps lifespan, we're going to be more reliant on a larger population of a larger population of elderly people that we need to support. So human lifespan is a big part of this because the labor market's also saturated. If you look today, think about how many congressmen, CEOs, presidents of companies are still people in their 60s, 70s, 80s even. And of course, CEOs are limited positions, but think about how much space can be made if everyone past 60, 50 even were able to abandon their posts and the young people can enter markets. But obviously, there's not that many people that enter the markets to begin with. But the young people who do want to enter the markets find that the market's already saturated. Finding a job is hard, especially jobs that can get you enough money to make a living and even support a family. So longer lifespans is another possible reason for this to happen. So sociologically, there's been a lot of arguments from the pro-Christian side that we've lost Christianity, obviously, and that means we're going to be less inclined to go live out God's message of to be fruitful and multiply. And that's not really a tenable argument because people who at the still lower, the highest birth rates still come from people at lower income brackets, and this is often reflected by race, which is where Hispanics and blacks come into play, where they have the higher birth rates, higher than white people, depending on which metric you look at, but more or less, that's the trend. So sociologically, maybe religion has to do with something, and that's probably true. Religion, maybe it's not a direct consequence of religious behavior, but has the loss of religion, as we discussed in the last video, resulted in certain social consequences that prevent people from meeting each other and making meaningful connections that go beyond simple pleasure or such. So we could probably make a whole video about this in the current state of the modern American youth, and how there's, I don't know, you could always say, there's a typical argument about dating apps, but are we disconnected in such a way that it's just less attractive to have a family? And the answer is probably yes. So there's multiple sociological and economical reasons, just to summarize, for the lowering population. So currently, so actually to answer the question, yes, we are unneeded. We don't have an actual bright future to look towards unless we start implementing some policy changes. So while people might do child tax credits, it doesn't matter if you're not making enough money to even buy a house in the first place, or mortgage a house, or rent a house sustainably. So the solution isn't going to be economical, I think, despite there being economical reasons for it happening. At this point, unless you can severely overhaul the economy, you're going to either have a revolution of, it could be peaceful or violent, to change the system because of how it's set up, and just simply the amount of damage that's being done by the current, by the future systems that'll definitely arise out of trying to fix this social security issue. Or we're going to find something that works for us, perhaps another great awakening that allows people to connect more deeply, and maybe virginity rates can go down. Maybe you're going to have more meaningful marriages, less divorce rates, better incentives to have kids socially, community, to be right. You're going to have to solve this in a way that solves it from the base up. Many people have attacked movements like the feminist movement as one of the main problems in this. This isn't entirely false, but the main idea of women working in the workplace has been beneficial for the economy. Yet, all this does is exacerbate the labor issue, and this is reflected in the longer lifespans. So, despite the moral issues, of course, there being in, supplying the elderly and all these things, you have to first consider as a government the social and political implications of enacting such policy. So you don't want to burden the youth, and you don't want to abandon the elderly. But when it comes to what's going to happen and what's going to be the worst thing that happens, I think revolution is probably the most dangerous thing that you don't want happening. So maybe find solutions that allow the youth to be more in control of their own funds and finances, such that they can afford to start a family. This is a longer video, a bit rambly, but if you have any comments, criticisms, questions, or concerns about anything I said in this video, or you want to discuss something more deeply, please leave it down in the comment section down below. If you liked my last video, we had some very good discourse between the commenters and I. So, thank you, and that's been the Rhetoric Reviewed. Out.